You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, a regular on Diasporic Music and has been a regular for a couple of decades. And Gerald Horne is the author of Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. And we have a lot of things on the table. I guess the first thing we want to discuss, Dr. Horne, is your review of 2024 and your analysis of 2024.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I think it's important for the audience as we begin to try to develop a strategy to combat rising fascism, not only in the United States, but we may get a further hint of that with the German elections in February 2025, when the Alternative for Germany neo-Nazi party, backed avidly by billionaire Elon Musk, is expected to do well. Having said that, let me point to a number of characteristics that manifested in 2024 that inevitably will be manifested in 2025 and perhaps thereafter. Point number one is the decomposition of the so-called collective West, which obviously is a term that is imprecise insofar as it incorporates not only Western Europe and the United States and Canada, but also Australia and New Zealand on the other part of the world. I think in assessing the United States, we have to see it historically as a kind of precursor of today's European Union. That is to say, that settlers a few hundred years ago, led by London, invaded North America, expropriated the indigenous population, and then enslaved Africans by dragging them kicking and screaming across the Atlantic. But for reasons that we've dealt with previously, not least being the rise of China, we see that the guarantor of world imperialism and the guarantor for the so-called collective West, speaking of the United States of America, is in very deep crisis. And as a result, it has begun to turn on some of its erstwhile allies, Canada in the first instance, which Mr. Trump has been insulting repeatedly in recent days and weeks. And I would hope and imagine, and perhaps you can address this, that in addition to there being a negative opinion of Mr. Trump and of the United States in Canada, is there a deeper analysis of how and why this turn of events happened? For example, is there a deeper critique, not only of royalism in Canada, which still obviously has King Charles in pride of place, but a critique of republicanism as manifested in the United States of America post 1776, which obviously was designed to not include any of us who were not emerging from the hollowed halls of whiteness. So I'd be very interested to know if there is a critique of the United States that moves away from the mythology of the past and moves away from this rather passé idea that your next door neighbor is akin to the Swiss Family Robinson or the Von Trapp family from The Sound of Music, when actually it's more akin to a meth-selling biker gang, for example, speaking of the United States of America. That is a long-term trend. That is to say, this decomposition of the collective West, which will then involve seeking to turn allies like Canada into neo-colonial appendages. Another long-term trend, of course, turns on this kind of outlier. When you speak of the collective West, I'm speaking of Japan, which bowled its way into the capitalist and imperialist camp post 1853, when it was on the verge of being colonized itself by the United States of America. This was in the wake of Britain seizing Hong Kong in the early 1840s, Britain invading what they called New Zealand at the same time. Japan was next on the chopping block, but they were able to go through an amazing transition and become an imperialist power itself. But now, with the Trump threats against Japan as well, that is to say that Japan is not going to be allowed to take over U.S. Steel. That is to say, Nippon Steel of Japan is not going to be allowed to take over the flailing and failing U.S. Steel, which is a slap in the face of Tokyo imperialists and capitalists, helping to solidify this idea that they have a certain kind of second-class status within the imperialist camp. Recall the so-called Plaza Accord of 1985, when Japan was surging and the erstwhile comrades of Japan in the imperialist camp ganged up on Tokyo and forced a revaluation of its currency that led to decades of stumbling economic development. Well, the trend you have to watch, and watch this trend very carefully, is a gathering entente between Tokyo and Beijing. Their foreign ministers have met in the previous few days. They're expected to meet again. This could be a real game changer. And obviously, as already foreshadowed, this change in the international situation involving a crisis of the imperialist camp and the inability of U.S. imperialism to remain as a guarantor of world imperialism is driven in no small measure by the rise of China, the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with new entrants, with other entrants banging on the door, demanding admission. This is a profoundly important long-term trend and inevitably will be manifested even more dramatically in 2025 and thereafter. With regard to near-term trends, that is to say, trends that could be long-term, but are certainly short-term, I'll point you to what is helping to envelop the blogosphere as we speak and the mainstream corporate media. Elon Musk and a number of his billionaire comrades have been clamoring for the continued admission of high-skilled immigrants, particularly from India, to Silicon Valley, to the high-tech industries in the United States of America. The MAGA base is up in arms, which is heavily comprised of middle-class and working-class Euro-Americans. They are firm in their opposition to immigration, whereas Musk, who of course has roots in apartheid South Africa, is flexible with regard to this opposition to immigration. And what this helps to dramatize is where the varying views of white supremacy, incorporated and articulated by the MAGA forces, with Elon Musk and David Sachs, also born in South Africa, Roland Botha, another South African apartheid refugee, perhaps the major domo of Silicon Valley. They are willing to admit, as noted, these migrants from India. And of course, there are those with roots in South Asia who are now administering Microsoft on behalf of Bill Gates, administering Google on behalf of Sergey Brin, for example. And so this is going to be a very interesting trend to watch, this so-called civil war within the MAGA base. In fact, in today's New York Times, if you go to that site, you'll find an op-ed by Russell Honore, who is a Black American. Recall the role he played as a Pentagon leader in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, 2005. He was saluted for his service. He has an op-ed basically accusing Elon Musk of being an agent of China. And of course, Elon Musk is heavily invested in China. Steve Bannon, Trump's former advisor, has said that he's a Chinese Communist Party plant. He says that Elon Musk's whole fortune is based upon Tesla and manufacturing facilities and joint ventures in China, for example. It's going to be very interesting to watch how that trend plays out. And of course, many have been predicting that Mr. Musk will be expelled from the highest ranks of the Trump team. The next trend that we're going to have to pay close attention to, it may be short term and it may be long term. Perhaps collective wisdom and intelligence of your audience can help us to ascertain which it will be. And I'm speaking of West Asia. I'm speaking of the Yemeni forces, Ansar Allah, referred to as the Houthis, and their ability to repeatedly attack Israeli territory. It is quite something. And the seeming inability of the Israelis and the United States and Britain to subdue and subjugate these forces, who of course have installations in the hills and mountains of Yemen, which makes it difficult to attack them. But according to certain sources, they develop weapons that the Israelis are unable to blunt. And whether or not that is a long-term or short-term trend will have to be ascertained. Likewise, with regard to how Israel is mirroring the so-called collective West in its decomposition, thousands of Israelis have fled the country for Australia, for Brooklyn, for Germany. What will be the impact of that, particularly as Israel expands into Syrian territory, for example, and seeks to depopulate Gaza, for example? Are those short-term or long-term trends? All of the foregoing, we're going to have to put our heads together and figure out what's going on so that we can develop a meaningful strategy to beat back the fascist attack.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons. The question you asked about the whole question of Canada and the Republic, there was a young man who you knew by the name of Charles Mindy Roach, who created a movement. He wanted to become a Canadian citizen, and he died. He never became a Canadian citizen, but the proviso he put it on being a Canadian, he did not want to pay tribute to the Queen, to the monarchy. So he had adopted an anti-monarchist movement, and Comrade Charles passed away, and the organization that he led, his second in command passed away, and it appears that no one has basically taken over his organization. But what has happened in Canada is that the cultural elements have come across, and they seem to be fighting for Kwanzaa and the whole candle situation. They're arguing about what colors the candle should be, and that type of thing. They're talking about these 7 principles, and they're not really talking about changing state power. The pouring libations, which, let me make it clear, I have no problem with that, and I really don't have a problem with us, not returning, but we are African people, and we have a right to be ourselves. But I think the fundamental question is, it's about state power, and Charles Roach was about state power and changing state power. So I think that I hope that answers your question about the Republican situation.
Well, yes, to a degree, yes. And as you know, I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time in British Columbia within a few months. And it's part of a research project that involves the Black exile in that part of Canada in the late 1850s, fleeing slavery. One of the characters I'll be studying is Mifflin Gibbs, and of course, Sir James Douglas, the founding father of British Columbia, who would have been defined as a Negro in the United States of America, given his partial African ancestry. And so my interest in Canada is in part academic, but in part it's strategic, because as I see it, Canada is going to be in the vanguard of this signal trend of the decomposition of the so-called collective West and the attempt to convert this erstwhile ally into a neo-colonial appendage. That's going to be a very intriguing trend to follow. But let me return to some of the important events of 2024 that we'll have to pay attention to in 2025. Now, of course, obviously, it is important to talk about what's happened in Syria, the takeover of rebranded Al-Qaeda, the so-called HTS, the seizing of Syrian territory, as noted by the Israelis. One does not have to be an oracle or a fortune teller to foresee, perhaps, an impending conflict between Turkey, which backed HTS, and the Israelis, which Mr. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, has been denouncing, rhetorically at least. There might also be in store a conflict with the United States of America, insofar as the United States has supported Syrian Kurdish forces in that country, whereas Mr. Erdogan obviously has hostility towards Turkish Kurds, Syrian Kurds, Kurds, full stop. That may bring him into conflict with the United States of America. That must be watched carefully. Then there's the situation in Southern Africa. Let's start with Mozambique, which has been beset by a religious insurgency, likely backed by Gulf monarchies, and indeed a trend that we're going to have to watch in 2025 is the rise of these religious insurgencies. We already know that they are backed, at least under the table, by Gulf monarchies. I'm speaking of, for example, the United Arab Emirates, which has played a very malignant role in Sudan, which is now teetering on the brink of famine. But it's also important to watch the religious insurgencies in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, not least northern Nigeria. And what we need research on and what we need revelations about is the extent to which former colonial powers like France, assisted by US imperialism, may be backing more than rhetorically these religious insurgencies against the Sahel states. There is reporting pointing that direction, but what we need is a kind of Julius Assange-like figure to leak documents online that will document without a whisper of contradiction this notion that the collective West, in their crisis, backed by their allies and comrades in the Gulf monarchies, are backing more than rhetorically these so-called Islamic fundamentalists, who, as noted, are ensconced in Mozambique and are contributing to destabilization of Mozambique in the wake of a hotly contested election that has brought youth into the streets. It is no accident that this is happening on the doorstep of South Africa, which is not embraced. That is to say, South Africa, the regime, is not embraced by US imperialism since they dragged US ally Israel into the dock at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, making it a plausible case for genocide, which then led in turn to criminal indictments at the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Netanyahu, which has made it difficult for him to visit, for example, Auschwitz, the former Nazi death camp in Europe, for fear that he could be arrested, for example. This is quite serious. It helps to explain why Mr. Biden, his last foreign trip was to Angola, Southwest Africa, once again on South Africa's doorstep in order to gain leverage against the former apartheid state. The news from South Africa is that the alliance partner of the ruling African National Congress, speaking of the South African Communist Party in the 2026 election, plans to challenge ANC candidates in local elections. This is driven by the aftermath of the late spring 2024 election, where the ANC vote total dipped to 42%, helping to convince the leadership to enter a shotgun marriage with the neo-apartheid Democratic Alliance, which in turn outraged the alliance partner, the SACP. We're going to have to keep close and careful attention on that crisis. Likewise, crossing the Atlantic with regard to Brazil, we're all very concerned about the health crises of President Lula da Silva, bleeding of the brain, amongst other problems, for example, which has limited his travel. There is consternation as to whether his ruling party, the Workers' Party, will be able to continue to thrive if 79-year-old Lula da Silva passes from the scene. Certainly, the trade agreement worked out by the Brazilians and their confederates in Mercosur, the South American Free Trade Bloc, the agreement worked out with the European Union, is highly significant. It's, again, a reflection of the fact that the EU is losing confidence in US imperialism as a guarantor of world imperialism and feels that it must work out other arrangements. Speaking of Brazil, you saw this at the G20 meeting just a few months ago, the Group of 20 meeting, where Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, figuratively threw himself into the arms of President Xi Jinping. It's quite a scene that you should witness online because of desperation in London that they may be the next Canada, the next erstwhile ally converted by US imperialism in its deepening crisis into a neo-colonial appendage. You also see a manifestation of this aforementioned trend with regard to the crisis in South Korea, where Mr. Yoon, the president, has been impeached. The acting president hasn't been impeached. You can expect the opposition to come to power sooner rather than later, which is good news for North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, because the liberal opposition takes a softer line towards the DPRK than the hawkish President Yoon and his conservatives. So these are some of the trends globally that manifested in 2024 that we must keep an eye on in 2025.
Dr. Horne, isn't it true that the person that was responsible for the assassination of Laurent Kabila in the Congo was a Muslim? I think he might have been from Mozambique. Something tells me his name was Malik. I remember hearing Abdullah. I remember hearing Farrakhan, second in command, talk about the brother that killed Laurent Kabila? Or do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do not recall that episode, but of course I recall quite well Laurent Kabila, the successor to the man once known as Joseph Mobutu, who had a hand in the January 1961 assassination of Patrice Lumumba, depicted quite adequately in the gripping documentary Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. You can find my comments about that prize-winning documentary if you engage in a simple search on your computer. Mr. Kabila, of course, was followed by his son, Joseph Kabila, and followed in turn by Felix Tshisekedi, the current leader. What I find striking about that part of Africa is this continuing conflict between Rwanda and Congo over events in Eastern Congo. Rwanda, as they say in London, punches above its weight. That is to say that even though it's dwarfed in size and in population by Congo, it's obviously able to stand toe-to-toe with Congo. At the same time, Rwanda has dispatched troops to northern Mozambique to fight and combat that religious insurgency backed by the Gulf monarchs that I spoke about a moment or two ago. And so going forward in 2025, we must also keep a close and careful eye on this conflict between Rwanda and the Congo over the tumult in Eastern Congo. And now that we're discussing Africa, I should also point out that there is this podcast, China and the Global South, which is interesting. I mean, I don't agree with everything that they put forward, but it's worth a listen. And one of their most recent podcasts dealt with the Chinese military in Africa. Apparently, the going trend is for African military leaders, particularly Ethiopians, and to a degree Zimbabweans, to be trained in China. And this is becoming of grave concern for U.S. imperialism, because we know that U.S. imperialism historically has tried to train African military leaders. And then, of course, for some reason, they have this tendency to go back home and engage in coups against civilian governments. And it was mentioned in this podcast that the military trained by China, they don't necessarily have that tendency, which makes it more attractive by civilian rulers in places like Kampala, Uganda, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Harare, Zimbabwe, to send their military officialdom eastward for training. And there was speculation as to what will be the long-term consequences for U.S. imperialism of having so many African military leaders trained in China.
Which is one of the reasons why I guess the imperialists fear China, because they have training as well as hardware, which they can distribute, I guess, to people that are fighting against various imperialisms. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, for sure. And that allows us in our remaining moments to return to where we began. That is to say, to reiterate, there is an ongoing crisis of world imperialism manifested profoundly within U.S. imperialism, which has caused the incoming president, Mr. Trump, to issue threats not only to Canada, but threats to Mexico. Recall that during his earlier term, he had threatened to bomb Mexico, threats to take over the Panama Canal, threats to pry away Greenland from Denmark. Once again, I think that this is causing a certain amount of understandable skittishness amongst junior partners in the imperialist bloc. Uneasy rests the head that wears the crown, were words written by William Shakespeare some centuries ago. And I think what that signifies is that, and I say this as a person who has been close relatively to political leadership in Southern Africa, particularly in Namibia, to a certain degree in Zimbabwe, and to a certain degree in South Africa, is that at that political apex, there's a certain amount of nervousness because you have internal folks who are seeking to unseat you. You have the CIA externally and their comrades seeking to unseat you. And so when Mr. Trump begins to issue these threats, countries, even powerful countries like Canada and Japan, have to take these threats seriously, which of course underscores once again why you should watch this coming entente between China and Japan, a response to nervousness about Mr. Trump and his cowboy-like intentions. The question is, how will Canada adjust, particularly as we've said repeatedly, they've managed under Mr. Trudeau to attain the remarkable feat of simultaneously having bad relations with China, Russia, India, and now the United States of America, which does not leave much wiggle room and makes it a very attractive target for Mr. Trump to tackle.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Dr. Gerald Horne, and the gentleman I was saying was responsible for the killing of Laurent Kabila. His name was Rashidi, an African name that many of us, including myself, used before. It was Rashidi was the young man who pulled the trigger on Laurent Kabila. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, we all look forward with eager anticipation to 2025. We look forward to monumental victories against white supremacy, against imperialism, against neocolonialism, against Trumpism, against fascism. So stay tuned to Diasporic Music and stay tuned to what's going on in the progressive camp.
Thank you, sir. And I would like to thank Lisa Watson for technical brilliance per usual. And Melinda Francis, you have any closing comments for the show?
Yeah, I want to wish all our listeners a happy new year and stay safe. And hopefully we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.